Welcome back to Velshi and Rule. Would you like to go?
That's cool. I can go. On Capitol Hill today, the political and legal battle lines have been drawn. The Democratic-led House Judiciary Committee is now threatening to hold Bill Barr, Attorney General Bill Barr, in contempt after Barr refused to testify at a scheduled hearing this morning. Chairman Jerry Nadler gavelled into the hearing anyway without the star witness.
The Attorney General refused to be questioned by staff lawyers in addition to lawmakers, but he did accept to be questioned for an extra hour. His fiery testimony yesterday before the Senate Judiciary Committee raised even more scrutiny over how he handled the release of the Mueller report.
All right, joining us now is a member of the House Judiciary Committee, Texas Democratic Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Representative Lee, good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
It's good to be with you both. Good afternoon.
If Attorney General Bill Barr had shown up today, what would you have asked him?
Well, I think the singular question, I hold in my hand the letter that I think stunned the nation at least, and that is from Director Mueller, an ex-Marine who just simply wants to do his job, who indicated just 3 days afterward how disappointed he was that these documents had not been issued not only to the Congress but to the public. In a series of questions after that, General Barr said he had had no conversation with Director Mueller and gave the world the impression that he was characterizing the narrative that Director Mueller wanted him to do. And he just outright couldn't recall, didn't tell the truth, and it's certainly an indication of a series of questions that would then follow about the whole issue of the obstruction of justice. You know, this volume, which is mighty, is a document against any other president in the United States that would raise questions about their ability to lead, and particularly the series on the obstruction, the whole litany of 9 different elements. And throughout the hearing yesterday, the general, who is supposed to be the chief law enforcement officer for the nation, continued to emphasize his belief that the president had been exonerated. The same narrative that's being carried forward now, and the same narrative of really going against Director Mueller, that he didn't really do his job.
Then why not spend the time today going through those 9 juicy nuggets in the 400 pages, or the other issues that came up? You could have sat down with Bill Barr today and gotten that information out there. The reason Robert Mueller wrote that letter is he was worried that the correct narrative didn't get out there. Democrats had the opportunity today to get it out there and get loads of attention.
Stephanie, you raise a very good point. First of all, we expect to have Director Mueller in front of our committee, and so we will hear from him directly. And I don't know if you heard me earlier. I really apologize to Director Mueller, as I said, an ex-Marine, someone who served as I was here in Congress, for his name being sullied yesterday unfairly. But it really is the fact that we had a narrative ourselves, and the Congress is Article 1 power, if you will, to explain and educate the American people on the facts. And it was evident that we thought that the process that we had articulated was a fair process. When all of the members, we cannot extend the time on members, that would be 5 minutes. And so we were willing to use the extended hour, which the general did agree to be used by staff counsel, duly hired, not any outside contractors who work for the Judiciary Committee, nothing dissimilar from what was done by the Senate during the Kavanaugh hearings. So we didn't think that there was anything inappropriate, and the general does not have the authority to tell the United States Congress how to do its job. We think the narrative for you, the First Amendment protected media, and the American people would have been far more informative had we had both the members, who are brilliant, asking questions, and then a quiet moment, an hour. By the way, 30 minutes to Democrats and 30 minutes to Republicans. We have no idea what they would do with it, but we think then the truth would actually come out from General Barr. He's very adept at spending a lot of time trying to hear what the question is and refuting the premise, and the time has expired.
Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, stand by for a moment, please. We've got some breaking news out of the White House about a letter from one of the president's lawyers to the Attorney General about the special counsel. NBC's chief White House correspondent Hallie Jackson has that news. Hallie?
Hey, Allie and Stephanie. Yeah, so this is a letter sent from the White House lawyer who's been working on matters related to Russia, Emmett Flood, sent over to Bill Barr, of course, the Attorney General of the United States. And let me highlight a couple of key things. This was obtained by NBC News from a White House source. And this is significant for a few reasons. It is a blistering, which you could call attack, I suppose, on the special counsel's report, describing that report as suffering from what Flood calls an extraordinary legal defect, that it deliberately fails to comply with the requirements of governing law. This 5-page letter, in sum, it's 5 pages, essentially defends the White House decision to, in effect, stonewall or agree not to cooperate with House investigations. And it explains it this way. Flood is making the argument that just because the White House cooperated with the special counsel, Robert Mueller, in a variety of ways, by providing documents, by allowing former and current officials to sit with special counsel interviewers, it doesn't mean that the White House feels that they need to provide the same level of cooperation to House investigators. Let me read you this key part. And again, this is from Emmett Flood, the White House lawyer. Quote, "It is one thing for a president to encourage complete cooperation and transparency in a criminal investigation conducted largely within the executive branch. It is something else entirely to allow his advisors to appear before Congress, a coordinate branch of government, and to answer questions relating to their communications with the president and with each other." So it goes on to say that the president is determined to protect from congressional scrutiny not only the advice rendered by his own advisors, but also by advisors to future presidents, basically saying, if we let our folks cooperate with you now, what happens down the road in future administrations? It could be really problematic. There's another interesting section in here, in addition to the whole letter, which we're going to post so folks can read it, that the special counsel's, what Flood describes as exoneration statements, can only be understood as political statements, not legal statements. Flood says words like that do not belong in the criminal justice vocabulary. That is a clear dig at the line from Robert Mueller's report, Ali and Steph, as I know you remember, that the obstruction piece of it did not exonerate the president, as Mueller so memorably stated. So this is a significant sort of volley back from the White House over to the Department of Justice, explaining to Bill Barr and, in effect, to the rest of the world what the rationale is for being able to say, listen, we don't want our folks to be able to talk with Congress. We think we've done enough on the criminal side of it. Making the argument, as we have heard from White House advisors before, that this is really political on the part of congressional Democrats. I'm curious to see how it's going to be received by those congressional Democrats, particularly after the 24 hours that we've had on Capitol Hill with Attorney General Bill Barr first showing and then, of course, not showing.
All right, Hallie, thank you for that reporting. Our chief White House correspondent, Hallie Jackson.
Let's bring back Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Congresswoman, so there you have it from the White House. They don't want to play ball. They don't want to cooperate. Does this put you in a difficult position? Because there are two different levels here. Criminal activity, while it might not reach that level, but the president and his administration could have been behaving in a way that would be considered impeachable, not fitting for the Oval Office.
Well, Stephanie, I don't think my colleagues will buy Mr. Flood's letter. I will not buy his letter. He's simply using attorney machinations to walk his president into the field of obstruction of justice. Frankly, the White House did not use executive privilege before, and so they're trying to backdoor executive privilege now by again sullying Director Mueller's whole entire report. And remember just a few days when it was no collusion and I've been exonerated, what a fine man he was. That is why we wanted to scrutinize Attorney General Barr, why we wanted the extended time with lawyers, because we knew that this was going to be an unfortunate long journey. But I will say to all of the writers of letters and the obstructionist tactics are going to be used. Democrats, again, want to be deliberate and studied. We will have no one force us into an impeachment process, but we are not afraid of it. We're not running toward it, but we're not running against it. And so as long as the White House continues to flip at every drop of the hat or every inquiry. For example, General Barr today sent this extensive letter about how he had offered a minute group of members of Congress the ability to look at the unredacted version. We've already rejected that. That is not the format that we have chosen. And frankly, there is a regulation that says release it in the public interest. That's what Director Mueller had said. So we will probably get a lot of letters. I think they are too late. I think the issue is out of the door, and frankly, it is time for us, in a respectful manner, to hold a hearing with General Barr to get the unredacted materials. We may be moving on a procedure in the coming days. We may continue to negotiate. But again, this is not a position of members of the Judiciary Committee to go after the President of the United States. Just like I don't think the members of the Judiciary Committee attempted to go after Richard Nixon. But there was a moment in history when the people of the United States said that we need a presidency of which we can have faith in. We're going to work with this White House as long as we can to have hearings that will produce the truth on these matters. And I would say this, on the Russian collusion, this is not about a personal issue as much as it is about the national security of the American people, for them not to have fractured elections where an enemy is engaged. And by the way, all of us who know this, who sit on committees like...
If it's about national security, why would Democratic members of the Gang of Eight, who had the option to see a less redacted version of the report, refuse? I would think they'd want to see everything they could if it's really about national security.
Again, you raise a valid point, and the response to it is this. Every single member of Congress has a top secret classification. We choose to let the Gang of Eight or the Intelligence Committee on the ongoing matters of intelligence for this nation. But there is absolutely no reason why any member of Congress, Republican or Democrat, cannot see the unredacted version. The White House knows this, and so does Attorney General Barr. And for the purposes of national security, the Congress should see it, and therefore know that what we were dealing with, as I indicated with this volume, is that we have a serious matter here, which is one of the reasons I've introduced HR 2353, that you have to report any engagement, you are the candidate, with a foreign operative within 72 hours. If that was in place, Director Mueller would have had a law that he could have processed Volume 1 on dealing with Russian interference with the elections. So to tell you that we must narrow the focus of the individuals to a Gang of 8 or 12 is not what we believe is right. And we're not denying Republicans. Republicans would see it too. National security issue, and no matter what Mr. Flood says about how wrong Mr. Mueller was, you can read that report. It's very detailed, and it does talk about the campaign intimately engaged with foreign operatives who are our adversaries. And we as the Congress as a whole must get to the bottom of it on behalf of the American people.
Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, thanks for your time today. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of the 18th in Texas.
All right, while the drama continues on Capitol Hill involving Attorney General Bill Barr and Robert Mueller possibly testifying, this is what we want to focus on: the actual evidence laid out in the special counsel's report.
So everybody's not going to have a chance to read the 438 pages, so let's dig through this for you. Remember that Robert Mueller outlined 10 instances of possible obstruction and left the decision to charge President Trump up to Congress. Number one, the president's conduct involving FBI Director Comey and Michael Flynn. Donald Trump wanted Comey to end the investigation into the former national security advisor, saying, quote, "I hope you can see your way to letting this go." All right, number two, the president's response to the Russia probe, like when he told then White House counsel Don McGahn to stop then Attorney General Jeff Sessions from recusing himself from the investigation. Number three, the termination of Jim Comey. Mueller found substantial evidence that of Trump's decision to fire him because of Comey's reluctance to say that Trump was not under investigation. Number four, the appointment of the special counsel and efforts to remove him. Donald Trump told advisors the investigation was, quote, the end of his presidency. Number five, efforts to curtail the special counsel's investigation, like when the president directed his former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, to have Jeff Sessions publicly announce that the probe was, quote, very unfair. Number six, efforts to prevent public disclosure of evidence. The president told his aides not to publicly release emails that revealed the setup of that infamous Trump Tower meeting back in 2017. And number seven, further efforts to have the Attorney General take control of the investigation, Trump pushed Sessions, Jeff Sessions, to publicly announce that he is no longer recused, but Sessions didn't reverse his decision. Number 8, the president's efforts to have McGahn deny that the president had ordered him to remove Mueller, but McGahn told investigators the truth anyway. Number 9, Donald Trump's conduct toward Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, and other possible witnesses. Those are redacted. Mueller notes that his sympathy toward them could have been intended to limit their cooperation with the investigation. And number 10, Donald Trump's conduct toward his former attorney, Michael Cohen. Once Cohen began cooperating with prosecutors, Donald Trump's relationship with him became hostile. On collusion, the report found no findings of direct conspiracy with Russia, but it did note that the Trump campaign knew about Russian interference and that the campaign expected to benefit from information released by Russian efforts. And let's not forget, there are still 14 open cases that Robert Mueller referred for outside prosecution.
But the question will be, with Bill Barr as the Attorney General, given his position, will they be tainted? I want to share a tweet from Eric Holder where he writes, any competent public corruption prosecutor would bring obstruction charges against Trump and win. The only reason Mueller did not was because of the flawed Department of Justice restriction against indicting a sitting president. So why is this important? Eric Holder is saying it's only because he's president were there not criminal charges.
Any other person who doesn't fall under the rules that the president falls under would have been pursued, as Eric Holder's point.
It doesn't mean that there wasn't wrongdoing. It doesn't mean that the president was exonerated. So it is massively important. Clearly, it was important to Robert Mueller, who never goes out of chain of command, to say the spirit of my letter was not translated by Bill Barr. That matters because it's how it gets reported, because you know that the president and Republican operatives immediately said nothing to see here.
For weeks.
Nothing
For 3 weeks
to see
they got
here,
to say that.
as in, no, the president isn't getting arrested. But his conduct may meet the standard, may reach the level of impeachable, or at the very least, maybe not someone you want to have in office next time around.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.